Our lecture series runs from fall into winter. We do 7 talks. And this, of course, is our final lecture of the season, and it's a very important one. This lecture is named for Dr. George Story, a name I'm sure very familiar to many of you here. We're very fortunate as well this evening to be joined by George Story's daughter, Kate Story. Kate Story is an award-winning theater artist and writer. Her latest novel, Urchin, published by the Running Goat Books, was a finalist for an Ellen Reads and for the Governor General's Literacy Award. She was born and raised on Southside Road in St. John's and currently lives in Peterborough, Nottingham in Ontario. And Kate has kindly offered to say a few words here tonight about her father and, of course, you know, they're the spirit of this lecture. So I'm going to turn things over to Kate now.
It's a real honor to be doing this tonight, and thank you also to Heidi Coombs, and of course to Dr. Willeen Keough for delivering this year's memorial lecture, and to all of you for attending. I'm extremely excited about this year's lecture. I'm currently working on a novel that's set in 1817 during the Winter of the Rouse, and the place of women in that society and that place and at that time has been obsessing me for quite some time. Tensions between Irish and English immigrants is definitely a marked element of Newfoundland history, and these pressures expressed themselves in complex and not always predictable ways. If you throw in the abiding tensions between male and female societal roles and an environmental and city fire crisis, you have a potent mix of combustible elements. But I'm a complete amateur when it comes to historical research, so I'm very much looking forward to what Dr. Keough has to say. To this day, women often find ourselves in particular dilemmas as we encounter formal and informal systems of justice. I think that's safe to say. And strategies employed may have changed since the historical period under discussion this evening, but perhaps not as much as we may think. Now, my father's attitude towards many things was, I think it's fair to say, opaque. He was a private person, and he also had a wicked sense of humor. And when I was growing up, especially as a teenager, when I was developing a keen sense of outrage around injustice, both real and imagined, my father would deploy irony as a way to elide my questions about his political beliefs. But I'll tell a short little anecdote. And unfortunately, I can't remember who told me this story. It wasn't either of my parents, but it was in the 70s. And as Jeff Webb points out in his wonderful book, Observing the Outports, it was common practice at that time for female academics to effectively lose their jobs at MUN if they married a male academic. And this happened to my mother, and she hung her MA over the kitchen sink in an ironic gesture that I appreciate far better now than I did at the time. Besides her academic work, she was also a pianist and she was a writer. And she was also, as anybody who knew her will attest, competitive. So one night there was a dinner party, and the guests were all male academics and their wives, and a jar of something was refusing to open, and it had been handed around the table from man to man, and each of them was failing to budget. And when it came to my father, he said, "Gentlemen, I will not embarrass myself. Alice, my dear," and he handed it to my mother, and she promptly opened it. She was quite triumphant about it. Now, to quote from the Historical Society's biography, the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society George Story Lecture is in honor of George Morley Story, 1927 to 1994, past president of the Society and winner of the Heritage Award for 1982 to 83. Dr. Story joined Memorial University's Department of English Language and Literature in '54, where he established an international reputation as a lexicographer and a Renaissance scholar, and pioneered the study of Newfoundland history, culture, language, and literature. His major Newfoundland publications include, with Herbert Halpert, the wonderful Christmas Mumming in Newfoundland, and of course with William Kirwan and John Widdowson, the Dictionary of Newfoundland English. We just called it the dictionary in our house. It was as fish equals cod. There was no need to name it. And it's become a touchstone for so many of us, artists and scholars and Newfoundlanders in general. It's not only a word hoard of the highest order, but it also illuminates the light and shadow of the lives of our forebears in this place. And I am sure I'm not alone in my gratitude for its existence. Dr. Story was very active in the public promotion and preservation of Newfoundland's cultural and historical heritage. He served as president of the Newfoundland Historic Trust from 1969 to 71, of the Newfoundland Historical Society from 78 to 81, and in 1980 he was named the first chairman of the Newfoundland and Labrador Arts Council. He was appointed director of the J.R. Smallwood Centre for Newfoundland Studies in 88, and in 93 he was named to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. And he was the recipient of several major honors, Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the Society of Antiquaries, and the Royal Society of Canada. In 1977, he was awarded the Canada Council's Molson Prize, and in 1988, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada. For his distinguished scholarship and crucial influence on the development of Memorial University, he was posthumously awarded a Lit.D. just a few days after his death. And that was on May 9th, 1994. He would have been absolutely delighted by this lecture, marrying, as it does, fascinating and vital elements of Newfoundland culture and history. Thank you and enjoy. I know I'm going to.
Thank you so much, Kate. We really appreciate that. And I also love the way in which you've tied to, of course, our topic and our speaker of tonight, who I'm just going to briefly introduce because we don't want to, take any more time away from her. But of course, our speaker tonight is Dr. Willeen Keough. Dr. Willeen Keough has notably just retired as a professor of history from Simon Fraser University. Her research interest of the years has included work on gender, ethnicity, immigration, oral history, communal memory, embodiment and affect, and she's written and published extensively. Notably as well, she has been a recipient numerous times with her research funded from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Keough received her PhD from Memorial University in 2002, and of course her very notable, amongst many publications, her monograph, The Slender Thread, Irish Women on the Southern Avalon, 1750 to 1860, was a renowned work in the field and was also very innovative at the time in which it was published, winning many awards, and of course being published at the time as an e-monograph, which we all kind of come to be very used to today, but was a very innovative part of Dr. Keough's research. Her ongoing work very much informs her talk tonight, and I just want to say one little thing about some of her plans for her retirement, a very active retirement involving, of course, being active with the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society. But she notes that she hopes to complete another major research project exploring articulations of masculinity during the Newfoundland seal hunt and related to animal rights and welfare protests into the 1960s and 90s. And she also, quite intriguingly, plans to return to a historical novel that she began a long time ago, a mysterious incident in which an entire population of a local community left without explanation, looking neither left nor right as they walked through neighboring communities into the grim silence into St. John's. So on that note of a very intriguing future and of course of her renowned academic past, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Keough and to her talk tonight titled Go to the Devil, to the Riverhead, to Your Own Bogs, Unsettling Femininity in Early Irish-Newfoundland Fishing Communities.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay. Sasha, can you hear me? All right. She's a little hard to hear. If she can hear me, everybody can. Okay, well, first of all, I would like to say, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Kate, for that lovely sort of connection with your father's work and tying it to the lecture tonight. I would love to meet with you and have a coffee sometime. That would be great. Thank you to all of you for coming out on this hideous, sloppy night. If it had been me and I wasn't speaking, I would have stayed home. But bless you for showing up. It's nice to see faces in the room. It makes a big difference. I've been doing a bit of remote teaching of late, and I have to say it's not for me. The work I'm talking about tonight, is work that has been ongoing for a few decades now. And it did start with my doctoral project, but I keep moving forward with it every now and then and going back to it and adding to it. And tonight I'll be talking about the Southern Avalon, but also Conception Bay. So I've sort of expanded my area of research and also the time period. So as I say, just in bits and pieces adding to it. And I'm so glad to be doing the George Story lecture this evening because he was a wonderful scholar, he was a wonderful storyteller, and I do like my stories. So yeah, I'm delighted to be able to share a few with you this evening. Now, you're trying to do something significant and important. So I'll wait for you.
Sure that everyone can see your presentation online. Oh, should be good.
Okay, everybody see it? Thank you to those of you who are online as well. I keep forgetting about you because I don't see you. Bless you for tuning in. So I guess that's it. Now I'll get going. Enough from me. So I will start by giving you a little story. And it relates to an incident. No. Oh, here we go. In Harbour Grace. On St. Stephen's Day, which is Boxing Day as we know it, in 1883, Orangemen parading in Harbour Grace with placards proclaiming no surrender tried to march into the Irish Catholic area of Riverhead. They were confronted by Riverhead residents intent on stopping this encroachment into their territory. And in the fighting that ensued, at least 23 were injured, 5 of them fatally. In the historiography, this incident has been presented as an all-male affair, but there were also Irish-Newfoundland women at the affray, a good few of them, and not just as observers, but as full-blown participants. They joined the Catholic countermarch, taunted the Orangemen, uttered threats, fired rocks from their aprons at the Protestant marchers. Christine Keough sounded the alarm as the Orangemen approached their neighborhood, a shotgun in her arms. Mary Brennan distributed guns to the Riverhead crowd from an old chimney on her property. Catherine Donnelly's house became a triage unit for the dead and the injured. She also dispensed firearms and was at one point in time seen on her front step with a gun in each hand, firing into the crowd. Now, as she was walking past Courageous Beach, you can see it in the little map there, which heads down towards Riverhead. Courageous Beach was an English Protestant area, so she was walking by that a couple of days later, and a resident taunted her, "Where are your bullets today, Mrs. Donnelly?" To which she replied, "I thought they were up the Orangeman's arse." These details come from you might think this is oral history, but actually most of it comes from witness statements, government correspondence, trial evidence, and newspapers from 83 to 85. And what we're seeing in this incident is Irish-Newfoundland women behaving in ways that challenge dominant discourses of feminine passivity and fragility. But their actions were not unusual for their own popular class community. Who would have expected them to be part of a communal response in this moment of perceived invasion of both physical and emotional space as well for the people of Riverhead? So let's put these Irish Newfoundland women in some context. You probably don't need much of it in this room, I expect. But, just to remind people that many nations fished off Newfoundland, and the first European fishers to actually settle were from the west of England, although Irish migrants came out in the sort of late 17th, but mostly 18th century into the 19th century to take advantage of opportunities in the fishery. They shipped on board West Country vessels, fishing vessels that stopped in Irish ports, as you can see there, the southern part of Ireland, to pick up cheap labor and cheap provisions. And very soon, a passengers and provisions trade that was Irish in nature also developed from those ports. So predominantly male and transient in the early years, this migrant group increasingly settled as Irish women came out as well. The relations between Irish Catholics and English authorities at the time were strained, to say the least. England and Britain had basically colonized Ireland from the late 12th century onward. And, with all the sort of dislocation from the land and displacement of language and culture that colonization entails. And the Irish were becoming increasingly rebellious, actually, in the 18th century, as Catholics in Ireland came under a harsh penal regime. So, we had all this sort of mounting in Ireland anyway, and then they come out to this island. And so, some of that tension came out here. And the British authorities in particular felt that tension, because not only did you have here Ireland, who was England's old foe, but Ireland's friend, Catholic France, was also out here with a fishery, with a little bit of settlement. And of course, every time that France and England went to war in Europe, then, the French would come barreling up the English shore here in Newfoundland and wreak havoc. And so the British authorities were very worried about the possible connections between the Irish and the French here in Newfoundland. So you see in the 18th century then this constant pitter-patter of concerns from naval officers and governors to the colonial office about the treachery of the Irish here. And just to give you a few examples, you can see here Captain Van Bruges worried about the great numbers of Irish Roman Catholics coming out, to the very great prejudice of His Majesty's Protestant subjects who dread the consequence that may attend them in case of war. That was in 38. In 49, Captain Drake saying that the Irish were notoriously disaffected to the government, and all of them refusing to take the oath of allegiance. So, these concerns continue to be expressed throughout the century. And when Britain and France faced off in the 7 Years' War in 57 to 63, British authorities here were very worried about holding the island. And the sense of panic was almost palpable in this piece of correspondence from Captain Williams to the Colonial Office. And he warns, as you can see, of the great numbers of Irish Catholics out here, the most outrageous set of people that ever lived. They were perpetrating all types of crimes, that the West Country and Newfoundland men, so obviously the Irish are not part of the Newfoundland men, so this would be, the Newfoundland people who were from the West Country, they were afraid to stay around. And the Irish owned 3/4 of the fishing rooms on the island. Not quite, that was a bit of an exaggeration. But you can see this sort of sense of rising hysteria. And of course, they were waiting to welcome the French with open arms. So this was a really worrisome time for British authorities here. And on the very eve of that war in 1755, don't worry, you can't really read that, I know, but this was my life in the archives. Right? The writing is not bad, but it's all the scratches from the microfilm reader that makes it so difficult. But anyway, Governor Doral really got his dander up and issued a flurry of court orders about Conception Bay, because Irish vessel masters out there were, mixing things up and flying the Irish colors and whatnot. And so they were poking the beer out there, that's for sure. Fishing premises were torn down, mass houses were burned, and various Irish were fined or deported or both. And immediately after the war, Governor Hugh Palliser issued some similar regulations and observed that the Irish were perfectly idle, abandoned to every sort of debauchery and wickedness, become perfect savages, are strangers to all good order, government, and religion. Well then. So we can see that constructions of Irishness as inherently idle, intemperate, treacherous, requiring constant regulation and surveillance, sort of running through that century and even into the 1820s, so into the next century again. The irony was, of course, that the Irish were needed for the fishery. They needed the bodies over here, but the Irish were not welcome for all that. Certainly not by British authorities. Now, the English planters didn't mind them, but you know, British authorities were quite insistent that they shouldn't be here, especially once the fishing season was over. Now, getting to the women, part of this discourse did focus on Irish women. And they sort of described them as, you know, being vagrant and promiscuous. Now, British authorities generally were discouraging the presence of any women in Newfoundland because they didn't want people to get settled at this time. You know, they wanted to maintain the hub of the fishery in the West Country, although the West Country merchants themselves were on a different plane, but this is what British authorities wanted, that everybody not stay. But local authorities certainly took the opportunity to comment, especially on the undesirability of Irish women in the population. So here you see a 1681 report from Captain Story saying that, you know, a great many of Irish women passengers, and passenger generally meant a fishing servant, and there were hired fishing servants who were women, were coming over and they married the local fishermen. And then they contracted debts and became extremely poor. And so, you know, this was going to be the ruination of the country. In the early 1700s, another officer objected that single Irish women were debauching ignorant mariners, especially those scandalous and prostitute women who stayed during the winter. In 1764, Governor Palliser, one of our favorite governors, he linked Irish women servants with poverty and unrest. And, you know, he's again talking about they're going to come over here, they're going to be distressed, they're going to become a charge to the colony, and there will be much disorder and disturbance. And so, you know, he is saying that no women can be landed without security you know, no Irish women be landed without security, first being given for their good behavior. And so vessel masters are going to have to make sure that they behave themselves when they come over. And it's interesting, you know, Palliser did not like the Irish Catholics, but this was his first anti-Irish set of regulations, and he homed right in on Irish women, which is kind of interesting to me. Another example, Governor Montague, 1777, and he also fashioning Irish women as promiscuous and conniving. And these women were going to come over here already pregnant, or they get pregnant on the boats, and then they'd hire themselves out to local fishing masters without telling them about the condition, and then the fishing master would be stuck with them. And in this order, as you can see in this bottom part of it, he's basically forbidding any vessel masters to bring Irish women servants over here at all. Where they, you know, 4 for 10 pounds. Well, that was pretty heavy stuff in the day. So this was a real disincentive to vessel masters to allow Irish women on their vessels. So Irish women immigrants, problematic, especially the single Irish female servant, because of her sort of social and economic independence, probably, you know, concerned that she was on the loose from the sort of patriarchal family structure, that she had this sexual agency that was going to just ruin the colony, and that, you know, she was a threat to the moral and social order. Yet all Irish women immigrants were unwelcome because, you know, you can see this subtext of fear running through these orders and regulations, that once you let the women come, then the necessary part of the equation for reproducing this undesirable ethnic group on the island would be there. So beware. Beware of what you're unleashing here. Yet despite this, an extensive discouragement from British officials, Irish women and men did, this is just a gratuitous picture to keep you occupied, continue to come to the island, especially well into the 1830s. You know, as I say, attracted by the fishery and also sort of weighing what was happening in Ireland. Things were getting a bit worse. It was overpopulated, increasing potato dependence on the potato culture, weighing the options, and over they came to see what they could make of it. So by the late 18th century, they were actually the ethnic majority in St. John's. By the early 19th century, they had established Irish fishing communities along the southern Avalon and in Conception Bay. Now, gender was in flux in this period, and Irish-Newfoundland women, especially those who were more removed from the civil and religious authorities in the capital, were able to carve out their own territory in the fishing economy. So I'd like to talk to you about that process now for a little bit. Now, of course, as in other European settlements in North America, certainly all women tended to stabilize the community and encourage population growth. But equally fundamental to community formation was, the women's contribution within the work cycle. They performed a broad range of inside and outdoor work activities, but obviously very key to the process of the settlement here in Newfoundland was their ability to adapt to fishing production, which was quite a feat for women who were coming from, farming communities and the woolen industries of Southern Ireland. Some of them were actually fishing employers in their own right. Here you see a grant to Mary Shea in Fairyland, giving her land that she was allowed to use for the purposes of the fishery. And that's the way that land was granted in Newfoundland in the 18th century. You didn't get outright title that you could just pass on to somebody else. You had to keep using it for the fishery, or somebody else could come along and say, well, they're not using it, so we'll have it. So Mary Shea, picking up a piece of land there, a number of women were the wives of planters, and so they were sort of juggling resources and, looking after fishing servants, many fishing servants in the run of the season. And then, of course, there was increasingly women moving into household production, which is, what I think a lot of people in Newfoundland are quite familiar with. Here we have a little group on the stage head. So what was happening is that they were moving into this as, to replace sort of the hired transient male fishing servants of the sort of older planter fishery. And, I like to sort of push people to think about this a little bit, because this was happening at the time that, well, of course, the migratory fishery in Newfoundland was really in its death throes because there had been so much warfare that they just couldn't keep this back and forth across the island happening. But the planter fishery here was also struggling really badly in the by 1815, because the Napoleonic Wars had come to an end. And that had been a period when, prices for fish were high, wages were high for fishing servants, everything was booming, and then suddenly the bottom went out of it. And so those planters could no longer afford to pay those high wages to get people over here. And so women, at this sort of critical moment, and I have tracked this in census returns and whatnot, you see more and more of them moving into the fishery, and they're taking the place of these male fishing servants who are no longer coming out in great droves. And, I like to think that without their critical intervention at this time, I don't know if the fishery would have survived at all, because it was so bad. The circumstances were so bad. So women, they processed fish on shore, splitting and washing and salting it, carrying it in barrows. I love this picture. I was told 25 years ago that women couldn't carry barrows because they were too heavy for them, and they had wet fish on them, green fish. And so when I saw this picture with the two women raising the barrow, they're right in the center of the frame, I thought, oh, yippee. Yes, of course they did. And people in the world tradition will tell you, yes, of course they did. Don't be so foolish. And sometimes, they were better at it than some, just because you're male doesn't mean that you have a lot of physical strength, right? So, some of them were pretty good hands at it. So, they would take those barrows over, like cliff faces and up and down and over hill and dale, trying to get to flakes to dry the fish. And just, the work was so important in the traditional fishery. Hired shore crews, so going back a little bit again now, and mostly male shore crews, they were paid more than boat crews. So they were paid more than the fishers. And the master of the voyage, which arguably mistresses of fishing households, took over that work as being the supervisor of the shore crew. They were paid as much as, and even more than boat masters. I've been looking this stuff up and finding it quite fascinating, right? So it was really important work. I think, people have a tendency, oh yeah, they help the men. Well, hang on now, okay? So women's skill and judgment, of course, just so crucial throughout the curing process, because of course, if the fish was damaged, or if it didn't contain the right amount of salt or the right amount of moisture for its intended market, then it would be spoiled. You couldn't sell it. Kentals of fish might become sunburned or maggoty if the shore crew wasn't, diligent. So it was difficult physical work that had to be juggled with childcare and other, housework, other outdoor work. And the processing of the fish, in the later summer, especially in the early fall, as things really started piling in, it was absolutely the priority for these women. Still, I'm told that these women did not view shore work as drudgery, that they loved to be at it. And indeed, fishing families that could afford to hire female servants or shipped girls, they were called on the southern shore, they did it not to enable the mistresses to sort of retire into genteel domesticity, but to free them up so that they could go down to the flakes to process the fish properly. In other areas, when servants were hired, this was a sign that, oh yes, well, the women could move indoors now, we can get them out of the fields and they can start, spinning by the fire. But that was not the case here. Women saw themselves as full participants in a family enterprise in which they had equal stakes. And they took pride in their capacity to contribute to the enterprise. And there was value and dignity in their work, and the community recognized that back in time. Now, women's vital contribution to subsistence agriculture, also very critical to the survival of the family work unit. It was very labor intensive, clearing land, planting, weeding, trenching, haymaking. I'm tired. Cared for livestock, especially the fattening of the family pig, and caring for the fowl, hens and ducks and whatnot. And those were things actually that could earn you extra sort of credit or cash, at the merchants. So no small deal there. It wasn't just all for family use. And they shouldered windfall branches home from the woods on wooden frames or in brin bags with massive loads so big you could just see their legs coming down the road. And they carried, 5 or 6 gallons of water from wells that were sometimes, half a mile or more away from the home. So they did a lot. They salvaged and recycled items from wrecks. Don't often think about that as being part of the work routine, but it was part of what women did. They were combing the beaches to see what would come in on the tide. And they were quite pragmatic about using these items, as were the men. It was all seen as, a gift from the sea, that it would be a sin to waste the stuff that came in. So they didn't get all too nice and delicate about it all. And there was no perception, and this is what I find interesting, if these were middle-class women, everybody would be like, oh my goodness. But there was no perception in their own community that they were less respectable because they were doing this. They were doing what was necessary to help their families get through. And in truth, women who couldn't go down to the beach or wouldn't go down if they were too sickly or too grand, to go to the beaches or to the fields or to the woods or what have you, they were objects of pity and scorn. It was expected that you be out there. Now, in these early days as well, I was quite fascinated when I started to find some of this stuff. Women did all sorts of work that wasn't necessarily for household production. Again, we sort of have this notion that they're sort of ensconced, and yes, they're on the flakes, but they're all ensconced in household production. If you look at surviving merchant account books, you can see that women doing a number of independent economic activities and having separate accounts, regardless of marital status. And some people think that anything that a woman did or earned went into the husband's account. No, not all the time, and certainly not in these earlier days back in time. This is Goodrich's, as you can see. But just think that, you know, because they're doing all this, and Newfoundland's economy operates on a truck or credit system, they were therefore a vital part of that whole exchange economy that's underwriting the fishery. Everything is moving through the merchant's books, and they're part of that. So you're looking at Mary Foley's account here. I'll help you make a little bit of sense of it. I didn't show you the actual account because you'd never be able to read it. But this is in Renews, and you can see that in 1840 she received supplies. Now, if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, she's receiving supplies from the merchant, and some of those supplies, I think, are in relation to sewing for community members. If you look over on the right-hand side, on the credit side, you can see that she has partially paid for some of her supplies by providing eggs and ducks and cream to Goodrich's. And she's also been washing and sewing for some fishing servants in the area. And you can see the male names there: Philip Power, John Sheen, William Rowe, John Beer. And this has been credited to her account. So this is helping her pay for her debt to the merchant. If you go to those men's accounts, there's a contra or balancing entry, and you'll see Mary Foley's name. And they are coming to the merchants with probably fish and oil, or maybe other things, maybe something that they got from hunting. And so that is how they are paying her. She's being credited that way. And so again, it's all sort of going around together. Julia McCarthy, here's another one. Some of the women actually worked on Goodrich's flakes. I found that interesting as well, too. If you look at 1841 down there, you can see 13 and a half days shore work for Julia McCarthy. There were any number of women who did that, as well as all the other things that they were doing. And you can see that she has also been doing washing and sewing for a litany of people in the community, some fishers and some members of the Goodrich family. And there are numerous examples. And I also see them in what we have of the Sweetman's accounts. So all these women making important contributions to family incomes through cash and exchange, extra credit. Some even had their profits, when they made them, applied towards their husband's accounts, and vice versa. But you see some women's extra going in to pay the husband's account. So, most remained in debt to the merchant, as did most men. This was a chronic symptom of the truck system in Newfoundland. But, the fact that the merchant was willing to sort of carry over their debts from year to year, I think, is very important. Very rarely did the merchant absolutely write somebody off. And so the merchant must have had some expectation of making something out of this whole system, to be paid somewhere along the line and maybe lose a bit another year or whatever. But again, the notion that they are part of this sort of very multifaceted working career, and that they're engaged in this sort of whole package of economic coping skills to help ends meet. So it's not really surprising then to see these women enjoying some considerable status and power and decision-making autonomy in their families and broader communities. They were household managers. responsible for looking. I mean, if there was any cash that ever showed up, then, the wife was the one who looked after it. And more often just juggling the resources of the household to make sure that everything just lasted them, and getting the family through the long and hungry month of March, as people said here, until the spring diet was extended by the merchant. And they were seen as partners, as not this sort of notion of helpmate. I helped. No, they were an important part of the family enterprise. And, they discussed concerns together. They made major decisions together. A man going down to settle his account with the merchant was usually well advised by his wife in advance as to what the balance should be. And if he totally blew it, then she was just as likely to go down to the road to the merchants and fine-tune the balance. There's an old saying, and it sort of rings true: she made the cannonballs and he fired them. So you've got that sort of veneer of patriarchal authority, but really, there's much more going on behind the scenes there. So I'm just going to briefly discuss a couple of spheres in which women exercised informal power. One was the spiritual realm. And to start off, I'm going to tell you a story about Mrs. Ellen Target of Cape Royal. She was a woman of Irish descent. And in the early 1900s, the Newfoundland Railway was building a branch line from St. John's to Trepassey on the southern Avalon. And Mrs. Ellen had a piece of property along the line, and she was hoping to sell it to the railway company for a nice tidy profit. However, local merchant and politician Michael Cashin, yes, he who became the Prime Minister in 1919, Cashin disputed her claim. Lawyers were consulted, but the quarrel would ultimately be decided on a less than formal basis. Michael had her fence posts on the property torn down under cover of darkness. Mrs. Ellen set them back up again, and every night thereafter she personally patrolled her property to discourage any further tampering with the boundary lines. Now, one night she was knocked out by the butt of a gun, and rumor had it that, Michael Cashin had hired the assailant. Advantage in the dispute seesawed back and forth until Mrs. Ellen's mother, the widow, Mrs. Ann Aylward, entered the fray and placed a curse on Michael and his entire family. Now, Michael's wife was also hailing from Irish stock. She begged Mrs. Ann to lift the curse, but to no avail. And shortly thereafter, one of Michael's sons, Richard Cashin, was returning home from nearby Shores Cove when his carriage overturned. Several days later, he died of his injuries. And everyone in the community knew that he had fallen victim to the widow's curse. Shortly thereafter, Michael actually withdrew his claim, and Mrs. Ellen's ownership of the land was secured. Now, there's a lot to digest in this story. I mean, I could just spend all night talking about it, but a key motif there is the widow's curse. And that's my segue into the spiritual realm, where Irish-Newfoundland women acted as spiritual guides and symbolic figures in both formal Catholicism and an informal pre-Christian system of beliefs and practices. Women kept their version of the Irish Catholic faith alive. It was nothing like what the priests thought it was, but what they felt it should be. They kept that alive in the late 17th and 18th centuries, when there was still that penal regime, which was sporadic, but it was still there and in play, and the priests weren't over here. And with that scarcity of priests, Irish-Newfoundland women performed marriages and baptisms. They assumed other religious authority. For example, midwives dispensed with fasts for pregnant women, for example. In a journal written in 1830s, the local priest is reflecting back on an incident in which women at St. Mary's took the sacred fire from an altar to burn a house. Perhaps, an exorcism or, some form of purification. You know, the Irish mother sprinkling the family with holy water. Oh my, some visions of my grandmother in the door when there was a thunder and lightning storm overnight, right? She was still doing it. But back in time as well, and before the priests came to bless the water, there were many sacred wells on the southern shore. I will have to investigate Conception Bay, but you know, it was part of Irish Catholic tradition that the waters that came from these little wells by the side of the road was sacred. Generally, Irish Catholic women are credited for observing rituals and maintaining the sort of identity of the ethno-religious group in the days of early settlement. If it was left to the men, I was told, should there be no religion at all? Can't disagree with that. In addition, female figures were prominent in the Irish Catholic hagiocracy of the island, harking back to, you know, powerful positions of Celtic goddesses and female druids in the pagan Celtic belief system. And that had carried over into early Celtic Christianity, remained very much in effect in rural Ireland, well up again into the 20th century, and it came over here. You know, like the Virgin Mary, the St. Bridget and Good St. Anne were a triumvirate to be reckoned with, you know, in the Irish Catholic communities here. What you're seeing here are 3 variations of St. Bridget. If there's time at the end, I'll tell you about them, but there's a Celtic goddess, there's the woman who most likely actually lived in Ireland in the 400s and 500s. And then, you know, the holy St. Bridget with her halo intact after the Catholic Church got their hands on her. So, you know, maybe we'll have time to get into that after, but we'll see. I'll keep moving now, though. So, Irish women, female figures, very much part of an alternative customary beliefs and practices that had come over from Ireland. And we must not look at these as just quaint folk traditions. Oh, isn't that cute? Isn't that sweet? They were an important part of the spiritual world of the Irish communities here. And, you know, that women were very important sort of navigators of that spiritual terrain for their communities. Certain people had special powers. Women in particular were profound at reading, really good at reading tea leaves, telling fortunes. Certain women, as well as men, have special healing powers, the ability to, you know, stop blood with a prayer, for example. And women's, you know, special powers were interwoven into the very physical landscape, because places like Mrs. Denine's Hill and Peggy's Hollow and the Old Woman's Pond, places where women had died, had, you know, the ability to cause horses to pull up and grown men to lose their way. So there was a very profound belief in all of that. And you can see that, you know, women were part of that whole system as well. The widow's curse, the ability to bring harm with the widow's curse that would drive fish from nets or cause injury or death. The Irish fishing community also attributed strong powers to incorporeal. Should have had a jig on that. Female figures, the Bibe, the local variant of the banshee here, was a female figure. An ancient crone whose wailing cry in the night was the harbinger of death. So too was the old hag, a supernatural creature who came in the night and sat on the chest of her victim, leaving the person in a state of semi-consciousness from which they couldn't find their way out. Anybody here had the hag? I have, yeah. I can see all my family members going like this. It's not pleasant, I can tell you. And then, of course, you know, we have Sheila. We all know Sheila. This is her manifestation on the landscape, but she was, you know, the wife or companion of St. Patrick, and she's credited with all those lovely ice storms we get on or just after her feast day of March 18th. Women also were prominent in fairy lore. And the belief in fairies was pervasive because fairy paths, fairy caps, fairy pipes proliferated in the woods and gardens just beyond the garden gate. This is a fairy path in Calvert. Women played a vital role in protecting their families from these troublesome creatures who just kept going back and forth between the natural and the supernatural worlds. And it was women who made the blessed bread that had special powers to keep their children from being stolen by the fairies, and also adults who were out beyond the garden gate or out, in the woods or in meadows would carry this bread to protect them from the fairies. Bread made on Good Friday was especially powerful. And women always tried to have a batch made on that day. And it's interesting to look at that because what you're seeing then is that sort of overlapping of two religious systems, the more formal Catholicism with the Good Friday and this ancient system of beliefs and practices. And that was no trouble to people. I mean, they weren't bothered by that. Like that, yeah. Throw it all in there. Let's see what we get. Mutually reinforcing. But this source of power was perceived by the Catholic Church authorities as competing with the Church's own power as mediators of the supernatural. And we do see a concerted effort by the Church to rein in unruly womanhood when it established formal missions on the island in the late 18th century. In Fairyland, for example, in 1789, Father Ure, who had just recently arrived, was complaining about the irregularity of women's marital arrangements. Now, notice it's the women's fault, not the men's, but it's the women's fault in the area. And he was complaining to his archbishop in Dublin that the magistrates had for custom here to marry, divorce, and remarry again different times. And this was sometimes done without their knowledge, so that there are women living here with their fourth husband, each man alive, and form different families in repute. And of course, again, the oft repeated concern that this is going to be a ruination. And what Father Ure was observing actually were frequent incidents of common law relationships and informal marriages, separations, and divorces in the area. And this was part of a marital regime that kept fairly loose reins on female sexuality, unlike what you would see in other places, and also enabled a number of women to sort of escape the repercussions of coverture, which was, basically the common law principle that a woman's legal entity was subsumed by her husband's. So she was sort of like a non-entity. Didn't get married, Bob's your uncle. In Fairyland district in 1800, the poll papers, and if you have checked them out, if you want to look at them, these informal arrangements made up 20% of family arrangements on the Southern Avalon. That's a chunk. But with the priest came this effort then to sort of bring women into church marriages. The church also, it used shaming mechanisms in terms of female sexuality. They brought out the nuns from Ireland to teach girls and, quoting Bishop Fleming here, fix their character in innocence and virtue. And, they really worked hard to create that little Irish mother, which they were working hard on in Ireland as well. They had more success in Ireland. I can tell you about that later, but I won't get into it now. But they were trying to get, these women to come in to sit by the domestic hearth. This was their proper place. And this, gendered civilizing mission of the church, it meshed well, with the middle class in the capital. But it did not mesh with the lives of Irish women out in the outports. So it was much slower to intrude there. Now, it did make its way bit by bit, but boy, I tell you, it was pretty slow because, those discourses did not match the reality of these women's lives. And I will say, too, that there was such pressure, especially as time went on, that the relationship between these Catholic women and the priests and the nuns who tried to make them ashamed of who they were was ambivalent in many cases. A second area that I'd like to get into, I'll try to finish up quickly here now, was in the matter of conflict resolution. And, whether that was through verbal or physical wrangling, or in individual assaults, for example, or in collective actions, or also through the court system, as complainants and defendants in a wide range of actions. They were there all over the place, from debt collection and employment disputes to matrimonial matters, criminal charges, court records, great place to look for women. And don't forget that this was a period of time when you didn't have all these government offices to help you through this and that. If you had a problem, you either duked it out in the laneway or you went to court. This was the reality of the period. So I don't want to give people the impression that everybody was criminal. No, not at all. It was a different thing going on then. So from the court records then, we get the story of the Berrigan women. And they were a very important part of their family's struggle to try to hold on to their fishing premises and renews in the 1830s and 40s. A view of renews there. Their property was on the south side, which you're looking at there. And in May 1835, a local merchant and Justice of the Peace, John William Saunders, initiated an action of ejectment to remove the Berrigans from their fishing premises on that south side. Saunders was initially unsuccessful, but he pursued his claim and met with robust and ongoing resistance from the Berrigans. By the later 1830s, he had managed to get his writ of possession. And in September 1838, the court records are all bits and pieces. You got to try to pull this stuff together. But in 1838, we see a deputy sheriff laying charges against Anastasia, the family matriarch, Alice and Bridget Berrigan, and various men of the family for violently assaulting him at Renews as he tried to execute that writ of possession in relation to the property. In December 1842, Anastasia, Bridget, and Alice Berrigan were again before the court, along with William Berrigan, to have charges of obstructing and assaulting yet another deputy sheriff as he tried to remove them from the premises. And then family members led the authorities on a merry chase through the Renews barrens throughout the cold, dark days of January and into, actually late December up to late January. Deputy sheriffs and constables made 4 separate attempts to bring them in and couldn't get them. And, of course, a part of that was, the conspiracy of silence from the community who were really supporting them. Because this could be them any day, somebody on their doorstep trying to take their fishing premises. But finally, most of the family turned themselves in on January 31st. Anastasia held off for another couple of weeks. She said she had a cold and wasn't coming in. But finally, in a hearing on February 23rd, a petty jury found them not guilty. So again, demonstrating that sympathy from the community for the family. Now, Saunders was apoplectic by this point in time, and in June of 1843, he himself swore a complaint that he had been personally threatened, assaulted, and prevented from taking possession of the fishing room by various Berrigan women and the ever-present Anastasia. Saunders claimed that his life was in danger from the frequent threats and assaults of the Berrigan faction and asked for the protection of the law. The records, as I say, not complete. We don't know what the outcome was, although the Berrigans are still up there. But the presence of the Berrigan women in the midst of the struggle is very telling. Because, we're looking at Bridget and Alice involved in 2 of those 3 incidents, while Anastasia, good old mom, was there every time. And their involvement, again, not unusual for the context. They were defending a family enterprise in which they had an equal stake. And they were not going to have this injustice, from the supplying merchant and the formal legal system. Conception Bay provides a further illustration with what was literally a turf war that unfolded in the summer of 1865. So in early July, as July 2nd, Mary Dwyer and Mary Hickey were rubbing turf in an unfenced bog just outside Harbour Grace. Mary Connors arrived on the scene and began to take the turf that Mary Dwyer was digging, shouting that the other two women should go to the devil to the river head to their own bogs, and threatening them with her mattock. It's quite a lethal instrument, I can assure you. Anyway, there are too many Marys in this story. You see, there are 3 women and there are 3 Marys. Oh my God. Anyway, we're going to last names now. Dwyer said that she would complain to the magistrate, but Connors declared that she did not care for Mary Dwyer or the magistrate or the devil. Connors raised her mattock over Dwyer's head and said that she would cleave her. She then pushed the handle of the mattock against Dwyer's face, threatened to drive it down her throat, and attempted to choke the other woman with her bare hands. So Dwyer did actually complain to the magistrate, and Connors was bound over to keep the peace. But again, you can see how nimble they are in working their way between 2 systems of justice. They're going to go like this first, and if they can't get it that way, they'll go to the magistrate. And you see a lot of that in the court records. And once again, they were exercising agency and influence based on their own interpretation of entitlement. Riverhead actually had reasonable agricultural land, one of the few places in the province that did. And so residents could produce foodstuffs, not just for themselves, but a bit for market and Harbour Grace as well. So there's a lot on the line here. Agricultural land. And many men, by this point in time especially, they were leaving the community for the Labrador fishery. They would be gone for sealing. Women were used to being on their own, and their landward duties and responsibilities intensified in the men's absence. So Mary Dwyer, the 3 Marys, were performing vital, arduous work in this incident. And they were also claiming rights to a contested portion of bogland. And when they were swinging their mattocks on 2nd of July, 1865, there was more at stake than just a few bricks of turf. So there are many such stories. You've been very patient. Many in court records for both areas. We must resist always, people say, oh, court records, and people's minds really sort of go to, oh, the woman is victim. Oh my, no, not not necessarily, no more than men, okay, in this period of time. And that sort of interpretation would really not, reflect the complexity of their involvement. For example, women in court cases involving assaults, they were aggressors often, almost as often as men. And when they were the aggressors, they targeted men as often as they targeted women. So this whole sort of, it sort of puts things on its head a bit, doesn't it, when we think about women in court situations. You can't come at it from present day sensibilities because things were quite different back then. And again, their assertiveness, not at all shocking to the community. They felt they had the right to protect themselves. And maybe their families, not necessarily always, you protect, they're out there for their families. Yeah, sometimes they were out there for themselves. Don't forget that either. Women are allowed to be selfish. They're allowed to have their own self-interests. But yes, no doubt they would be concerned about their families as well and their communities. So many moving between that informal and formal justice. Local magistrates in fishing communities gave women access to formal legal processes. They generally meted out similar, sort of sentences and punishments and judgments to men and women. The only big difference was that they didn't tend to, and I don't think I've ever come across a case where they actually lashed a woman, whereas they would lash men. So that was the only difference. Otherwise, you don't see a big discrepancy. And they didn't try to force women back into failed marriages that you often see in court cases involving women. They upheld fair and decent treatment for them in employment contracts because they were essential workers in the fishery. And certainly, although these magistrates, started to monitor the behavior of their own womenfolk increasingly, so women in their own class, and you see a difference between, like the 18th century and the 19th century in this. You do see merchants' wives and magistrates' wives coming closer into the home. They did not try to pressure fisherwomen to transition quietly into economic dependence and respectability. And that was happening to women in other jurisdictions, working class women, but it wasn't happening in Newfoundland or in these Irish communities. And I figured that this is because these local magistrates were often merchants or members of merchant families that made their livelihood supplying fishing households in exchange for salt fish and oil. And those household production units needed women working in public spaces, out in stage heads, flake shorelines, in the woods. Women in various economic capacities were also very much a part of that local exchange economy that was underwriting the fishery. So the magistrates disposed of court matters with a strong appreciation that they too were dependent on women's work in the fishing economy. In other places, you see women being described, they're not real workers, they're not essential, they're not required, they're problematic, they really shouldn't be there. All that discourse, of course, contributing to giving them lower wages than you would give men, but that's what was happening in many other places. Here, there's a different kind of dynamic, because basically, it wasn't in the interest of local magistrates to encourage the withdrawal of these fish-producing women into the respectability of the private sphere. And I'll just conclude by saying I interviewed both men and women, and they told me that women pulled extra weight because of their combined productive and reproductive responsibilities. As one elderly man told me, sure, the women did it all, we'd be dead without the women. Another man, he was trying to struggle with, those sort of older marriage partnerships vis-a-vis more modern, contemporary gender relations. And he said to me, there was none of this men against the women stuff back then. Everybody was equal, everyone was the same, everyone had their work to do and they did it. That was all there was to it. So these Irish-Newfoundland fishing women lived their lives in public sites of production. Most were self-assured, physically hardy, essential workers, and engaged community members. And that persisted even into the 20th century, despite these sort of imperial and church discourses that attempted to position them otherwise. And I don't mean by saying that to try to belittle the impact of systemic discrimination against women. Formal laws discriminated against them. Religious discourse discriminated against them. I don't mean to belittle that, but I do feel that in their day-to-day lives, things were often different. And in this particular context, the women may well have felt oppressed by their class, their ethnicity, just as the men in their communities did. Would have been the same for the men. But in their day-to-day lives, I don't think if somebody had bothered to explain to them what the concept of gender was, that they would have felt oppressed by their gender, generally speaking. So, and I also think that this is how the broader community has remembered them. And I think it sort of, fell under the radar for a while, and especially, when the fishery was changed with Confederation, and women were, women weren't important. They were shunted into plants, but, it's just minor work, and we'll give them lower wages. The classic story in anything that's modernized and industrialized. So for a little while, they disappeared from view, but I think and I know that Newfoundland has brought them out and is dusting them off again, and it's wonderful to see. So thank you very much. You've been great. Very patient, and I wiggle on.
Wonderful. So first of all, on behalf of the Historical Society, Willeen, just thank you for an engaging, wonderful talk. And I, for one, could have listened to stories all night. But I do know we are, cognizant of our time, but we do fortunately have plenty left for questions. So I know I've seen some comments trickle in from online. I'm going to get to those in a moment. But first, I'm going to open it up and ask if there's anybody who happen to have any questions here. And if you do, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone. Okay.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for the pictures of my family that I saw there. I hadn't seen those pictures before, and my cousin is online. I said, is that our family there? And indeed it is. That was Ellen and Ann Elward and Ellen
Yes.
Trask, I believe, is it? No, Ellen Target. Yes,
Target.
Ellen Target. I wondered about the merchant class. Like you talked a lot about the class of the fisher people.
Yeah.
Were women treated with the same respect or the same level of equality in the merchant class as they were in the fishery?
I think that, in many respects, they did have a good deal of respect, I guess. I always feel like I'm treading on dangerous ground here. What you see happening increasingly is that they are more and more disempowered because they're no longer economically important, other than as somebody bringing money into a marriage. They don't have that function that fisherwomen did, and working class women or what have you. So, but they were out there and very much involved with family matters. I think in the 18th century, in community matters. But then in the 19th, you increasingly see women, and this is women, all middle class women. They're put on pedestals. They're brought indoors. They don't need to work in the fields anymore. And you think, oh, well, that's nice. You don't have to work in the fields anymore. But with that comes a loss of status and authority. So it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? You can sit and not do very much. Not to say, now there are lots of middle-class women who still did a lot of stuff. And they were great community workers and whatnot. But they don't have, I don't think that they have the same sense of authority about what they're doing. They kind of feel like they've got to sort of fight to get whatever power they're going to get in a way that I think that these women on the ground, didn't experience it in that way. So in the day-to-day life of living, they didn't have to do that. But, you do see them, doing things that are good for the community, for education, those kinds of things. You see a lot of them, though, clustering together and having little fetes and concerts and like if they were raising money, then that's, for a good cause, that can be good. But I still feel that these are the women who really got lost in history. These are the ones who were taught that they weren't as important. And it trickles down into like working class communities because they are the ones who are in closer contact, I think, especially in industrializing cities and large towns and whatnot. They are the ones that run into that rhetoric that men are workers. They're the ones who are essential. And of course, the employers can never really afford to get rid of women. So there's all this discussion about how women are not as skilled, they're not as strong, they're not as essential. And that's the way that women ended up getting this. And it took a long time to sort of fight back from that again. And we're still struggling with it to a certain extent, right? It's a lot better now. But that was a whole process that we can see in, certainly throughout Western Europe and North America. It was quite an insidious little system. And you do also see, working class men, for example, going along with it, saying, yeah, I want a breadwinner's wage. I will earn enough for the family. I will support the family. But they never quite get it. So the women still needed to go out to work, but now they're getting the crappy wages. Right? It's interesting, all those patterns. Wasn't very good time for women, I don't think.
Thank you. We'll just take a moment to do some of the questions online, and then we'll go back to the audiences. I know we've got a few there.
Oh.
I'm just going to squeak by you, Willeen.
Yes, ma'am.
Take a look at the chat. I think there was one or two there. Oh. Oh, I do believe, sorry, I was just making sure because we had another one. One question, I think this might have been your family member there, was where did you get that picture of great-grandmother O'Brien? That one is a dying, we do need to know that one.
That's in our family. And that was a cheat, because that's Bridget Aylward. It's her sister. I cheated. Never have family. Public talk. You know what it's like when you're trying to find stuff and you're trolling around, trying to get anything that might vaguely resemble. I'd get away with Mrs. Ann. I thought, I might get trouble from Audrey right in front of you. I wasn't. It was Bridget Aylward.
Bridget Aylward. Oh,
yeah. I did say Anne. I thought I'd get away with it. No, I didn't have a picture of her. She was the widow. Yeah. Sorry, I cheated. No, not.
Mystery solved. We do have another, we also want to note as well that someone says as well, they've been trying to cast curses their whole lifetime, but it's not worked yet. So, keep at it though.
But be careful, because with a curse, if it's not deserved, you can't just go around cursing everybody. If it's not deserved, it will fall back on you. So it was serious business. Good to know the rules. That's right.
It's true. It's very important.
Yeah.
Andrea also wants you to know as well that she has a picture of Anne if you want it. So this is what I know.
Absolutely.
So on that note, Andrea, please email the either Willeen or the Newfoundland Labrador Historical Society.
Please.
Make sure you get in contact with Willeen about that photo.
Please.
And we do have one other question there in the chat from Michael Boyle, and he asks what about women and the Irish language? If you could speak to any of those points.
I'm of the impression, I don't come across much Irish language in the records that I'm looking at. I don't think I came across any. The women that I was looking at, I sort of go with the general idea that it was an English fishery that people came out to, and if they didn't already know English, and a lot of them did by that point in time, because in Ireland, the Irish language had been under attack for a long time. So they were losing the Irish over there in that part of the world. But people did hold on to bits and pieces of it. Phrases and ideas and whatnot. Whether it was particularly women who held on to it, I don't have a sense of that, and I'm sorry. I would love to know more about that and be able to speak more intelligently about it. My own grandmother used to, say a few things like, "Oh, you Amadon the devil, where did we get you?" Or she would talk about my bag as being, she would say frahulik. I've been told by the Irish that it's supposed to be flahulik. You're carrying around a great big bag with everything in there but the kitchen sink. So those kinds of little phrases come through, but no, I'm not any expert on that. Sorry.
Thank you for that. I'm sure for Michael's question. I do know we have a couple over here in the audience if you wanted to. Yes.
Thanks so much. This has been my life for the last 35 years doing Irish genealogy. And most of my Irish ancestors are from Newfoundland. So, but in my searching my name is Dalton. I found James Dalton in Fairland. I don't know if you came across this record or not, but he married an O'Brien, and she was the widow of a merchant. And she had him sign a prenup so that her children got the money, not him.
Well,
which I was shocked. This was early 1800s. But I wanted to find out about whether this was a particular Newfoundland phenomenon, because my family, a lot of them moved to Nova Scotia and to New Brunswick, Shediac here in New Brunswick, and I don't get the sense of the same sort of passion or matriarchal society that existed there that existed here, and I'm wondering how maybe the British attitude towards colonization in Newfoundland created this sort of unique situation.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, I would give a lot of credit to the fishery, the way that it eventually played out as creating very powerful and strong, women as well. And I can't speak for the English populations in Newfoundland. I can only speak for the Irish. I do find that sort of spiritual system very compelling to me as well, that alternative system, especially that they had a lot of power. But your ancestors who moved to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, what did they end up doing? Farming, yeah. Oh, wow, yeah.
The silver fox industry is founded by my ancestors in New Brunswick and PEI. So, but that was because the land they got was so poor they couldn't farm it.
Yeah.
And Tormentine area is very marshy and not very. They couldn't grow potatoes there. So.
Yeah. I think if farming women were strong women as well, right? But somewhere along the line, the balance tipped in that case. And maybe it's just because Newfoundland didn't industrialize and modernize as quickly as other places. Could be part of the picture there as well. Because you're in a broader context. You're not just frozen in your one spot. And so what's happening around you is also affecting you. And people's attitudes towards you are affected by what's around. And if you're in a situation in which everybody's in a household production unit, it's going to be different from if you're running a farm, isolated farms, especially a fox farm, I guess. It's interesting to think about, though. Yeah. There are Dalton and O'Brien. Those names are in my family, too. We're all related. Oh, my God.
We have another
Yes.
question. Oh, sorry. I know.
Hello, John Joy.
Yes, John Joy.
How are you?
Recognize you. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I just wanted to say that there's somebody in the audience here who's been doing a lot of work on Notre Dame Bay. And Doyle Wells here behind me, his
Where are you?
grandfather.
Oh, hi.
His grandfather was a magistrate in the western side of Notre Dame Bay.
Right.
And he's transcribed all of his court records between 1909 and 1914, and also made the donation of all of which were very broad from the time he was a Newfoundland magistrate, and not with the Newfoundland Constabulary all through the time that he was a magistrate. And I've been assisting him with this, but we're finding there's a lot of women presence in the court on the west side of Notre Dame Bay. I mean, these are mostly, Protestant communities. There are Catholic communities there too, but that whole part of the coast. And we've been finding a lot of women involved as accused, women involved as complainants, women involved as plaintiffs, women involved as defendants. And one of the most interesting things that we've been finding, a significant number of slander cases. And slander cases could not be conducted in magistrates court for some time, but there was some changes in the late 19th century that allowed it. And they were quite vigorous cases. And so, I mean, this is the Protestant part of the Newfoundland and Labrador world. And I just want to make one comment related that you may have more, other people that are studying this type of thing in not only in Irish communities, but also in people who came from the English tradition. But the DAISY committee, the SS DAISY Legal History Committee, has been publishing books for the last 20 years, and some of the books have published, and you're aware of them, the ones that about the magistrate merchant, the merchant magistrate Carter in Fairyland, and a lot
Which
of
that had been out when I was doing my doctoral thesis.
well, that's right.
I was grubbing around little bits and pieces in different repositories. Yeah.
But then there's also been a series of cases published about Labrador that Gus Lilly and others were involved in. Doyle and I are working on a couple of volumes so this is easy access for people who are interested in those records.
So where
The DAISY Committee books are available through the website of the Law Society.
The Law
But
Society,
also you can go pick them up at the Law Society in Water Street. So I just wanted to
well,
put in a
thank you.
plug.
And I would love to see somebody doing comparative work on English communities back in the early days, right, as well, because it's a real sort of whole. But I know what it's like to go through those kinds of records. I mean, I went through court records. Oh my God. I mean, there was a room full of them at the archives down in the Colonial Building. And it was just, you just had to take one off the shelf and start going through it. They were not really well organized at all. There would be a whole variety of years, like, 19 or 1852, 1797. I mean, they were just all over the place, and some boxes would have judgments and some would have orders. And all I could do was go through every one of them, sheet by sheet by sheet. And I transcribed what I used. So things are a lot different now with the digitizing of records and whatnot, and people taking the trouble to go through them and transcribe them and make them available to other people is just fabulous. And I mean, I see a million graduate projects coming through, right? As people start combing through them. So thank you for letting us know about that. Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's great, John. I mean, the DAISY Society does just incredible work. I believe I have one more question here, and I don't think I see any more in the chat, but we have plenty of time for a few more as well. If anyone wants to put their hand up and let me know to come over.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. I worked at CBC for a long time, and one of the most interesting jobs I ever had there was 5 years that I worked for the Fisherman's Broadcast, as it was then called, 1980 to 1985. So every day I was on the phone, and my colleague Wilf Dyke, and then later Jim Wellman, phoning to try to get fishermen to talk to us about what they had been doing that day. By the way, a lot of our tapes were then deposited in the Folklore and Language Archive. If anybody is interested in the events in the fishery in the early 1980s, the first half of the 1980s, those tapes are there. I don't think anybody has ever used them for any academic purpose. Pardon me?
Is there sealing stuff about sealers?
Well, we interviewed people 12 months of the year, so yeah. Especially, and during the time of the big protests that were going on, like up on the Northern Peninsula. Oh yeah, there's all kinds of, anyway. But what I wanted to say was, in making those phone calls to people's homes to try to get somebody to talk to me that day about whatever they were doing, whatever the fishery was that day, I would always get the wife first, right? Because she'd say, oh no, he's still down at the boat. They're in, but he's at the wharf. He's on the boat. I said, well, how did he do? Oh, he got this, he did that, he went here, he went there, this happened, that happened. She told me everything. And I say, well, do you think he's going to be back? Like, I have a deadline, and no, he's not going to be. I said, well, why don't you do an interview with me? No, I'm no good to talk. I'm no good to talk. And meanwhile, I know she was running the family business. Mm-hmm. We used to do a lot of interviews about, back then there was an issue, I think fishermen were having trouble with their income taxes, and they wanted to get more organized about that. So we were always interviewing people about how to do it properly and blah, blah, blah. And it was the women who were looking after the bookkeeping side of a lot of these businesses, right? And now I think somebody here may know more about this than I do, but I think now it's evolved. I think a lot of women are now crew or skippers because you didn't get UI
No,
if once the boat tied up for the winter, if you were the woman working on the business at home. I mean, they
God bless the
click,
Canadian
click,
government.
click, right? Anyway, so I just wanted to throw that out there that there are all these tapes in the Folklore and Language Archive, if anybody wants to
Okay.
do some of that research.
Okay, thank you very much for that piece of information. I'm definitely interested.
Just say, yeah, I love the spirit of this evening, just talking about, just digging into more and more stories. Like, that's wonderful to see that energy. I think I see one person over here. And is there anyone else? If you want to let me know to come to you, put your hand up.
Hey, Willeen, thanks so much for this. And I will say on the bookkeeping thing, on the farm side from New Brunswick also, my mom did run the bookwork on a very large farm for years for like next to nothing and found it very thankless, not to mention getting no EI. But I was going to ask you two questions that are not really related. My first question is, how common is the name Anastasia for Irish women in Newfoundland?
Yeah.
Because this is the second Anastasia that I've heard, and the other one I was just like, that seems like a really weird name.
You do see it in the records, but older records, right? The other thing about, don't forget that there were intermarriages, and so it could have been coming in from, it is an unusual name for Irish, isn't it,
Yeah.
Anastasia? Yeah, yeah. I have, yeah, she certainly wasn't the only Anastasia that I saw. So maybe it was a fad for a while. Who knows?
Mine was she was Catholic and she was in St. John's. So she married the author of an autobiography that I worked on. So he was a Barnes and he was Protestant, but she was Catholic.
But she was Catholic.
I can't
She
remember
was
what her last
Anastasia.
name was, but it was Irish. I remember it just being like Anastasia. And you're
Oh,
just,
clarity.
yeah, something like that.
This can't be right.
And the other question is about the records. The woman who had records, like she had been doing the washing.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in clothing and cloth. Was it very commonly merino that they were purchasing? Or is this,
Yeah, very, very common. And you'd see some cotton as well. But
Okay.
merino, oh yes.
All right, that's really interesting because
So yeah, go and get the Goodrich's.
because I'm working on the
Legends.
Bonavista Vista records, and it's very commonly swan skin in
Yes,
Bonavista
I
Vista.
see. The merino, yeah.
Merino.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I've seen other places where they prefer dreadnought. So
Didn't come across
yeah.
that. No.
No, I'm just wondering because I think it has to do with the merchant, the source of the merchant in Britain,
Yes.
whether they're coming
makes
from
sense.
Scotland or West Country.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Makes
no,
sense.
that's really
Something
interesting.
to puzzle about.
Yeah, well, I'll have to tweet you about it later.
Indeed.
I know. Thank you. That's a really good and interesting question, especially the one about names. I also want to note we did have one other comment there in the chat that I think where Andrew Bryan said that we do see Gaelic names in landscape features and in words and expressions. As Willeen was telling us about your grandmother, have you? And we've also got someone saying several Anastasias in St. Mary's Bay. It must. Okay, this one might need to be solved. This is another mystery.
Yeah.
All right. We're at.
Yeah, that's where I saw most of them actually, was in St. Mary's, and they would have had a mixed population down there.
That's great. Well, we're at 9:00 and we've got time for one more question, and I see one more hand up, so you're gonna close our night.
I need the mic. I think the name I think that
the name Anastasia is common. I know various people in my area of Conception Bay. There may have been a saint. I
Yes.
think that would, people were often named after saints, even if it, and there may have been a nun named Anastasia. So there's definitely a commonality of Anastasia. Just wanted to offer that as a possible source for the name. Of course, it could be that there was, as you say, a fad at a certain time.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, my mind doesn't necessarily go in those directions, but it's reminded me of a story now, because when I said that it might be because of an intermarriage in the St. Mary's area in particular, when I was going down to do oral history, a woman from the area very kindly came along to introduce me. And she said, now I'm going to take you to talk to Dad, but for God's sake, don't tell him he's part English. He'll kill the two of us. Because a lot of English fishers came into the Irish Catholic population through intermarriage. And then, everybody just, you were Irish. That was it. Everybody was Irish all the time, just like St. Patrick's Day.
Well, I think that is a wonderful note to go out on. So thank you again to Dr. Willeen Keough.
Thank you folks very much.
It's been a wonderful evening, a wonderful, I think, spirit too of thinking about research and solving mysteries. And so on that note, thank you to those online and in person and for being with us throughout this lecture series for this past academic year. Have a wonderful, hopefully soon spring.